My name's Eamon Cohen, and I'm the conference producer for the Business Travel Show, and I also work for Business Travel News. And today's session is mobility compliance. This session is going to be, as you can see from the title, why it's both a new challenge and a new opportunity. So now, why are we having this session? Well, the basic reason for it is that, very simply, if you're sending any of your travellers across a border, that's not as easy as it used to be a few years ago. We always think of things as being progress, but sometimes, in some ways, things can become more complicated, and that's very much the case at the moment in the world. There have been some underlying issues for some years. There's a whole lot of tax issues, which we're going to hear about today, that can really complicate business travel, that often get overlooked. Then, specifically within the European Union, there's a question of something called A1 certificates, social security certificates, and the Posted Workers Directive, and being compliant with those presents a whole lot of issues. There's a whole lot of other general immigration issues as well. For example, certainly during the Trump presidency, going to the States became a lot more complicated. On top of that, we've then had Brexit in the UK, and that means that getting onto this island, if you're from the European Union, you're coming here for business travel, there could be a lot more paperwork to do than there used to be in the past, and vice versa for anyone going from the UK to anywhere in the European Union. And then, if that's not enough, we've had COVID and all the issues around how you get into another country now, about what testing and visa, testing, quarantine requirements are, etc. So mobility has suddenly become this absolutely massive issue for travel managers, and so we're calling it a challenge and an opportunity. Why is it a challenge? Because basically it's a pain in the backside now, this mobility business. And why is it an opportunity? Because it's a pain in the backside. So someone has to manage all that complexity, and that's something that potentially can make your jobs more valuable. And I'd like to quote to you from one of the great, the most august and revered experts in travel management, who said this recently in an article I wrote. He said, "It's so much more than managing the travel management company and the policy. You have to have a broader mindset for immigration and tax issues, as well as health and security. Saying, here's your passport and e-ticket and off you go is a thing of the past, at least for the next few years." And the great sage person who said that was this gentleman here on my right, Stephen. So I'll just introduce you very quickly to the panel. We've got from Newland Chase, who are immigration experts, and that's Carsten Osberg, who's the European Managing Director. From Global Tax Network, we have David Livitt, and then here on my right, he's the EMEA and APAC Travel Manager for Ford Motor Company, Stephen Swift. Now, they're all very shy people, so please encourage them by giving them a huge round of applause. Great. Is Esther going to be joining us, do we think?
She's just been sent a link.
Okay. So, all right. So if one of you could let me know when and if she joins us, then I'll introduce her as well. Great. So our first speaker then. We're going to have a very quick polling question. On Swapcard, on your show app. Ah, here we are, Esther. Esther, can you hear us? Hello, Esther. Earth calling Esther. Can you hear us? Oh, well, all right. We'll let them sort that out for a bit more. So let's ask this question in the meantime. Then, if you go onto your app. Then and call up the session that you have, then you can there's a polling question for you to answer there. Do you have that question in front of you? It's not working? All right. That's
The old show of hands.
yeah. Okay, we're going to do. Luckily, I did print them out. At least I think I did. Thank goodness for that. Good old-fashioned paper, sometimes the answer. All right, so we're going to do the old show of hands. So, right, very simply, how well informed do you consider yourselves on how Brexit, A1 certificates, posted workers directive and tax issues related to business travel? So your choices are very well informed, moderately informed, I know these are important issues, but I know very few details, or I know nothing. So let's start if you think you're very well informed on this subject. Great, we got one, so I'll be picking on you later to test that. Put your hand up if you're moderately informed. Right. I know these are important issues, but I know very few details. What about if you're in that category? All right. And what about I know nothing? Excellent. Well, I appreciate everyone's been very sincere about it. Madam, are you a travel manager?
I'm not a travel manager, but I do work for a service provider that provides
Okay, so it's your job to be an expert on this.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Lovely.
Get out.
Great. All right. One other thing, while we're sort of wrestling with all the technology, I hope this one will be working. I have to say, we really are learning a lot today, so apologies for that. But if you register on Swapcard, you can click a calendar icon on the right-hand side, and from that you'll receive, if you click that, you'll receive notification which will allow you to rate this session sort of 1 to 5 and leave a comment if you want. No need to leave a comment about technology, I think we know. Esther, can you hear us yet? Esther, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yay.
fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your patience. So that's the last travel manager to join us, the last speaker to join us today. Esther's in the Netherlands, and she's joined us virtually because very much in keeping what we're talking about with mobility, it would be very difficult for her to come here because if she went back, she'd have to quarantine, because even if you've been vaccinated, you have to quarantine at the moment returning to the Netherlands from the UK. So Esther is Global Travel Manager for Van der Lande Industries. So thank you so much for joining us, Esther. So we'll go to our first presentation, and our first speaker is going to talk about, particularly about the Brexit and the Brexit rules and various rules around A1 certificates and posted workers directive. So big round of applause please for Carsten. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eamon.
There's a really bad connection, I'm afraid. I can't hear you quite well.
Okay, we'll be bringing you in later, Esther, so you don't need to worry at the moment, but I hope you'll be able to hear some of what's said.
The slides, please.
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Wait, can I have the slides? Not the right slides. The slide deck is not here.
Sound is really bad, yeah.
What I miss?
Are you able to send a message to Esther just to tell her that we'll be bringing her in later?
Awesome, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah. So can everybody hear me? Is it working? Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much, Eamon, for this introduction. And I'll speak to you today about the challenges posed to international business travel by Brexit, A1s, and the posted worker directives. All very sexy topics, I know. Thank you, Eamon, for providing this opportunity for me to speak about that. I'm going to speak very high level. I got about 10 minutes, which is far too short to go into depth on this, which is probably a good thing for myself. First of all, the posted worker directive, it was originally made to between the member states that went into the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992. This was made because there was a difference in minimum wage in certain countries, where some countries were and still have minimum wage that's higher than other countries. They wanted to protect the unfair competition, at the same time protect the posted workers. So this is actually something that's been around for a while if you look at the treaty itself, but the posted worker directives that we know as today were revamped a little bit last year, and they are being followed up, and you can be fined if you don't follow the guidelines. What is probably important to know about that is also that it doesn't really matter about your nationality. It's really more about where you're residing and where your work is, your employment is. So even if you are, for instance, a French national going to France, but you reside in, let's say, Belgium, you could potentially be a posted worker. So it doesn't help that you have the passport of the country you're going to, which complicates things a little bit, obviously. So this is a somewhat burdensome process to go through, time-consuming, and again, I mentioned the fines, and also the reputational damage is always something that is a risk if you don't follow government guidelines. Moving into Social Security in Europe, and what Eamon mentioned a little bit about the A1, it's also called the Portable Document A1, which is all about your Social Security. That is an application you file in the country that you reside. So it's about who is paying for the social cost of you. So if you don't do that right, you could end up as an employer paying social cost for somebody that is traveling to another country. And again, it's something that has been around for some time, probably been a little bit neglected by companies. Other things have probably been more important. And I think we'll go into Brexit shortly, but I guess it's a little bit, I see that Brexit has triggered the acknowledgement that there is something called A1, Posted Worker Directive, because suddenly we realized that the freedom of movement has somewhat been restricted. On the A1 side, it's issued by the local Social Security authority in the country you reside. Each country has different processes. A number of countries are online, a number of countries are not online, and it's everything in between. I got one, I live in Sweden, it's offline, it took 2 months. It was valid for 12 months, but minus the 2 months that it took to get it. It could be generally valid up to 24 months. What is very important is if you get a workplace inspection, and there is a thing called the European Labour Authority, ELA, that is working cross-border to do those inspections, is that what they will ask for is the A1 if they find an employee in the office that is not employed in that country. They will ask for the A1 certificate immediately. And again, you could be fined if you don't have that in order. And as you can see in the slide, it's applying basically all kinds of directions, so there's little exceptions to that process. Brexit. So this is probably something that we all have top of mind. It's been coming for a while, but I think that the COVID situation has probably overshadowed Brexit somewhat. So freedom of movement was something that we were used to before. I guess most of us in here would probably hold a European passport. It's quite a strong passport. We don't need a lot of paperwork to go to most countries. Now, when you got Brexit in place, there are certain things you need to adhere to. So I put a few things in the slides, like if you go to the UK now, for certain reasons, you would fall into the work visa category. If you go to a conference like this, generally it will be fine. But if you go for a paid speaking session, there would most likely be a work visa required to get so. Also, when you go then the other way around from the UK to EU, you need to consider that most of the countries have slightly different processes. They don't have necessarily the same rules. And not all countries are yet to have an agreement with the UK. Most countries have settled with the UK. I think Switzerland was one of the first ones to do so. But you need to kind of look into the different rules and regulations before you send your UK citizens abroad. And there's a few pointers, like UK nationals are now excluded from the EU passport lanes. But one thing that is probably more important that a lot of people might not know is this ETIAS. It's an ESTA-like system that's in place, supposedly in place from 2022. It was supposed to be in place this year. COVID delayed it, like many other things. It is very similar to what we know as the ESTA process to the US. There is also something vice versa called the ETA that is currently in place for a number of Middle Eastern countries traveling to the UK. It's not 100% set in stone yet exactly what that will contain, but it's due to be fully implemented in 2024. And it's something that you probably need to watch this space for. And then a few pointers at the bottom. At least 6 months left of your passport is a good rule of thumb, always when you travel, no matter if you go to and from the UK. And also the stay up to 90 days and 180 days period is also something that is quite common when you go to visa required countries as well. So, how to solve this? Eamon gave me a few minutes to try to walk through the high level. It was very high level, I know. How to be compliant. So you want to maybe define or redefine who's responsible within your company of these different processes. Could be HR, legal, mobility, travel. Who's doing what? Do you work with a supplier on these topics? If you work with a supplier, does that supplier do all of the different things? Or do you need different suppliers? Or do you want to handle it internally? And again, who is the stakeholders, who's taking care of it? Also talk to your TMC to get the travel statistics, because the TMC would hold the statistics on who's traveling where and when. And again, coming from where I'm coming from, we usually look at the visa required destinations. Suddenly you need to broaden the picture much more. Map your travelers, what kind of passports do they hold? Where do they reside? It could be essential for these topics. And then finally, educate your travelers on the processes, potential pitfalls, consequences, reputational damage, etc., and prepare in due time. So I would recommend that you look at 2022 now. I know that COVID is blurring things a little bit, but try to get your travel plans in order for 2022 at least. And even consider maybe sometimes short-term mitigation where you might want to deploy an EU citizen for certain work instead of a UK citizen until things are settled a little bit more. We have seen recently that companies tend to work on what we used to do, and then we send UK workers to do certain work assignments in EU, and suddenly they need a work visa, and that doesn't necessarily come overnight. So the timeline is essential as well in this process. Finally, COVID-19 impact, just to kind of like put the icing on top. Obviously, the COVID-19 impact is then further blurring the picture a little bit. I used to travel 100 days a year, last 14, 15 years. I have been traveling through the pandemic, but mostly the last 3 months. It's been quite interesting from a paperwork point of view. I have never printed anything for the last 15 years when I've been traveling. And suddenly I'm printing all kinds of stuff. So travel restrictions are many these days. It's changing every day, every hour sometimes. You need to register often with the destination country. Like some of us that went to the UK, we registered with this a locator form. It's quite a swift process, but it takes a little bit of time to get through it. If you cannot submit online, which you can for the UK, but for instance for the Netherlands, it's an offline form. You need to print it and bring it with you. It doesn't mean that you necessarily will be checked, but you could potentially be checked at the border. Also the vaccine certificate. I traveled with a colleague to a number of countries, and his certificate expired. So his vaccine is still valid, but the certificate tends to expire every 2 months, depending a little bit where you're from. Mine does it as well, so I need to download a new one in due time instead of being caught out on the border. You'll be let in, but it is time consuming and it delays a little bit your arrival. And also sometimes there's a requirement for an additional COVID test prior to entering the country, and sometimes when you have entered the country, even though you've got your double jab. And again, if there's not an app for that, or if you can't have it on your mobile phone, you're worried the battery will get will lose. Print it again. And then finally, we've had a number of colleagues where we traveled to the same destination. The colleagues were traveling from the same country, different carriers. Carriers were saying slightly different things, because not to blame the carriers, because this is complex, but it could be interpreted slightly different. So all of this is just adding to your travel program. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Carsten. Thank you. Great. Just before we go to the next speaker, could I just ask you to say just a little bit more about when paperwork is now required for travelling between the EU and the UK? I mean, when I've sort of written about the subject, I've brought it's a very crude way of putting it, but the simplest way I could find to put it is that if you're travelling from the one to the other and you're doing some sort of paid work for that, basically if you're invoicing someone for the work you're doing when you travel from the EU to the UK or vice versa, then there might well be some sort of visa or work permit required. Is that a reasonable?
That's a reasonable, theory. Yeah, it's generally a rule of thumb would be there's a work visa required. So I would recommend you do an assessment before to figure out what you need. Usually the assessment will contain a few questions, and on the back of the questions you get an answer. The questions will be regarding the type of work you do, are you paid for it? That's a key factor, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, just taking what I do personally, I'm sort of self-employed person. I do lots of ducking and diving and bobbing and weaving. So one thing I do, sometimes I go and do paid speaker moderating work in the EU. would I need something for that now in future?
So to the EU, every country could have different rules. So it's not necessarily the EU, but the country you are visiting that might have slightly different rules than another country, depending a little bit on the mutual agreement between the UK and the country in question. It could be that you need a work visa. If the UK is requiring the other way, there's a tendency that the other country will do the same, just like visa requirements. They tend to go both ways.
Right. Okay.
And the paid work is where you would probably be have to be careful.
Do you want to tell them about carnets?
Well, when you transport goods across from EU to the UK or vice versa, there is something called a carnet. It's often used for fairs like this. It's a document where you can bring your goods without paying customs and taxes and duties. But let's say it's a fashion show and you bring a number of shirts or suits, you will have to show that to the customs before you leave. You have this ATA carnet document. And then when you come back to your country, you would need to show again that you still have X number of suits and shirts, whatever, so that you didn't sell anything in the country you visited or exhibited. And there's an ATA carnet, is the document type for that. It's something that you will then need to avoid paying duties or taxes for that. And if you don't have that, you will have to pay duties and taxes. Yeah.
And one more acronym for them, just to make it even more depressing. CITES, CITES. That's the Certificate Something Something Endangered Species. So basically, if you've got, I play the double bass, and I've only done it once. I played a gig in France, and if I had to take my double bass now, if I were to go and do that again, I'd need another whole certificate to take that over, because it's an old bass. It's made from wood. I don't know what wood, but it's again, it's a whole other lot of paperwork that you would require for anything that might be made from an endangered species, whether animal or vegetable. So those are all things that didn't exist before Brexit, when we're going between the EU and the UK, but now do, that you have to factor in when you're sending your people from one to the other. Great, thank you very much indeed. So now, as if that hasn't blown your mind enough, let's talk about tax.
Go on, Dave.
So please welcome to the stage David Livitt.
Thank you very much. Actually, I'll stay here. I was going to get up, but I think I'll just sit here. I don't have any slides. I didn't want to overwhelm you with all this tax knowledge that there'll be a test on at the end of this 8 minutes. Just to start off with, I think it's what I've seen in the last sort of 20 years around business travellers. It's changed remarkably. When I started out, it was very much, we were very much focused on tax and the 183-day rule, and that's really, really changed. And I think now, listening to Carsten, and we work very closely with immigration lawyers and professionals in the collection of data and the management of business travellers, and as well as travel managers now as well. So it's much more of a sort of holistic process, data-driven, to really identify where the risks are. Now, pre-pandemic, there was a lot of noise. You probably heard a lot. You probably maybe heard about business travellers getting stopped at the border and being asked what they're doing. They may have needed a work permit or a visa. And then generally the tax position was one of those things that just kind of disappeared maybe in the business, and you waited until an audit came from an authority to say who's in this country, and are you paying tax on their behalf when they're working. So what's really happened in the last 10 years or so, there's been much more focus from revenues on basically getting their money for your employees going into that country and working even on a temporary basis. So what I'm going to do is break that down a little bit in terms of, well, what does that mean and what do you need to be compliant? The first myth to dispel, as I said, was that 183 days rule. So some of you may know there's a network of tax treaties, fascinating reading. If you ever have insomnia, please check them out. And they're generally, there's probably, most countries have sort of between 80 and 100, pretty much. And what they do is they exempt an individual from being taxed in a country based on usually 3 criteria, which is they're in the country less than 183 days, they're not paid by that other country, and none of the costs attributed to their being in the host country, are recharged. So as a tax provider, we've often relied on that to exempt people from taxation. But that treaty position is generally the last bit you get to. So you have to work through the domestic rules first. So if you're going to another country as an employee and you're working, potentially you are taxable from day one, and domestic rules may say you have a payroll requirement. Now, if someone goes to let's say you go to, let's choose somewhere, Germany for a week, how many companies are really going to put you on a payroll for 5 days? I mean, it's not likely to really happen. So it's something around being aware of the home and the host country rules around the payroll piece. Is that payroll required from, at what point? Is it day 1? Is it day 30? Is it somewhere a bit later on? So that's the first thing to consider. Likely is they're taxable, or we'll come back to the treaty in a minute. There's payroll that's due. The next issue is, what are they doing? So with immigration, this is where we work closely. Typically immigration will look at the duties, the tasks, what's being performed by that individual. Well, that's also relevant for tax, because we want to know what that individual is actually going to be doing whilst they're in that other country. Is it a meeting? Is it training? Is it, the best one we always use is, are they concluding contracts on behalf of that country, of your company? That may drive a corporate tax issue as well, something called permanent establishment. And again, that could be a really bad position to get into. So knowing ahead of time what your employee is going to do is really important. Then we get to social security. So again, social security is different from tax. So a different set of treaties and agreements between countries, usually called totalisation agreements. Within the EU, you mentioned the A1s, and Carsten covered that piece. Globally, there's something called a certificate of coverage. And again, it's not every country. In fact, it's less of a network than the tax treaties. So you get this strange anomaly where you may have a tax treaty to exempt someone from taxation, but then you may have to get, you may have a social security requirement. The thing to do is, again, check before you're actually sending someone overseas. And the last piece, and it's very much this posted worker and directive and how we work closely with immigration and companies around this is, you've got the A1 certificate, which is obviously required, again, as we were saying, where there's something a little bit more substantial than just a business meeting or maybe a conference. And that leads into the notification and various other things as well. So what does that mean? You've got all this together. So you're suddenly bombarded with all these. I've now got immigration, there's duty of care, there's health, there's all the budgetary side of it. And now I've got all this tax to think about and payroll as well. Well, I break it down into 3 sort of buckets. So before, during, and after. So before, do that assessment. Where is that person going? What's the combination of tax issues, both domestically and internationally? Is there a tax treaty to cover that individual? Work through the permanent establishment and the corporate tax issues and get the documentation in place. During, tracking. And this is a bit of a contentious issue. How many people like to be tracked by their employer? Not many, I imagine. So generally, if you're on business, and obviously you're using the travel system or an expense management system, collectively in our supply chain of providers, we are using that data to monitor both how many days you spend in that month, in the year, and a rolling 12-month period in that other jurisdiction. Because again, these can all be cumulative issues. So during the trip, it's very much get your employee to keep that calendar up to date. And then afterwards, when they come back, again, as I mentioned, that's that cumulative nature. So one trip might not create an issue, but by the time you get to the 4th, 5th, 6th trip to the same location, you may have actually created, that individual could have created a bit more of an issue in the tax space. So it's adding to the sort of pain of business travel. I think the direction of travel by revenue authorities is they're broke, basically. They all need their cash. I live in the US, and New Jersey is $3 billion behind its revenue target from last year because of just remote working and lack of sort of people coming in and being taxable. So they are going to be auditing and really looking at companies to pay the bill. What are your people doing here? And you've got to pay for their when they're working. And how are they going to do that? That's through audits. Whether that's individual, probably unlikely because they might not know, but I'll come on to that in a minute. But the second one is payroll audits. So that's going to be the easy way for a tax authority to challenge a company, is to actually get that payroll audit. Where are your people? Are you operating a payroll? Do you need to, etc. Individual stories. I mean, we've probably all got war stories around people getting held up at the border, or people getting caught afterwards through audits. Again, some of the more interesting ones, just to give you a quick snippet of one. One company posted on their website that they had a great year, and one of their C-suite was, because he'd been working between two countries, was getting this massive bonus and equity award. Well, congratulations, you just announced to the tax authority of the home and the host country that that person is now subject to tax. So it's those issues that the authorities are looking at. They're sharing data with immigration, border agencies as well, Canada, Malaysia, even the UK to some extent. So I would say in this space, just really watch out, think through the issues, work with the travel manager, the immigration team, to really get hold of that data to assess who and what people are doing and are they at risk. So,
Brilliant, lovely. Thank you very much indeed, David. Thank you. Okay, so I hope that's given you an idea of the vast complexities there are now around mobility. So the question is, what are you going to do about it as a travel manager? Well, I'm delighted we've got two travel managers joining us, one in 2D and one in 3D, who are going to explain to us how they bring all that together, how they work with the rest of their companies, because you can't do this clearly, it's not something you can do on your own as a travel manager, but how they track it, integrate it, and generally work to mitigate this. So I think we'll start with Esther. Esther, can you hear us there? Hello, Earth Calling Esther, can you hear us? How can we get through to Esther? Shall I go up to the camera and ask her to... Which camera is it? Sorry? Oh.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hear us?
Can you hear this one?
Yeah. You're on, Esther.
Something wrong with the mic, because I'm talking and
Yeah. Well,
Who is this?
Esther, we'd like you to talk about how you run your mobility compliance strategy. Sometimes I wish it was 1983 again.
Who is this? Esther, we'd like you to talk about how you can run your mobility strategy.
there's a difficulty. I don't think you can hear me. Can't hear you.
I'm very sorry about this, ladies and gentlemen. AV team, any recommendations of what we ought to do here? So what do we do now?
There is an outbound and everything is connected the same as before. But
I'm very sorry about this,
So-
ladies and gentlemen. Of what we ought.
All right, so do we need to unfortunately carry on without Esther? Is that what you're saying?
I believe that would probably be wise.
Okay.
That's a second delay.
So,
could you kill the video and just have her as a speaker, just on the phone?
Oh, would that work? To have her sort of phoning it in, as it were?
Not the way this is done.
No. Okay. All right. I'm really sorry about this, and even more apologies to Esther, who's waiting there to speak and is obviously prepared to speak to us. But luckily, we've got a backup. He's a star. He's a star of the show. I don't think I did that very well, did I, Stephen? So, as I mentioned earlier, he's the doyen of travel management. So, on that note instead, please tell us about your mobility compliance strategy,
Sure.
Stephen.
So how I got sort of involved in all this is for some time I was asked to look after mobility as well. So I was exposed to the lovely world of immigration, tax and social security through managing our regional mobility program. And what happened in those times was we would have regular meetings with Deloitte, who are our tax provider, and that's how I know Dave. And they'd come in and they'd tell us about all of these scare stories around the travel patterns of some of our people and how they were creating issues for us. That's mainly just around Europe. At the same time, our travel patterns in general were causing us issues, because what we tend to do is we tend to travel while we have a fairly big program and people travel all over the world. We also go and launch products in certain places around the world. So we'd have, for example, guys going from the UK to Turkey, 60 guys a week for a long period of time. And so what would happen is, similarly, US to Canada, Mexico to the US, the visibility of that travel was quite easy for, you know, the immigration authorities and everybody to spot. And so they were saying to us, look, these guys should not come in on a normal visa. So what, you know, I think for all of us around the room who are business travel managers, the old, if you like, the old way of doing things was call your travel agency, book your flights. They would tell you if you needed a visa. You got your visa and off you went. And that was clearly not becoming enough, because we had people turned around at the border. Some of the issues you talked about there, not necessarily permanent establishment, but certainly tax issues that were arising. I don't want to go into too much detail, but just there was an overwhelming amount of evidence that we had to do something about it. The challenge was, and I think you'll probably find this yourselves, is nobody wants to own it. Because travel say, well, that's mobility because it's got the words immigration and tax in it. And mobility say, well, that's travel because you're traveling. So what do we do? So the challenge for us to get this off the ground and get it recognized by the company was, how do we raise it up to the top of the company as an issue? So for a brief period of time, I worked for our OGC, so the head lawyer for Ford. And I took it to him and I said, you know, as the accountable person in this company for all of the actions we take, I think we need to do something about this. And he said, you're absolutely right, Steve, we really do need to do something about this. So we had put a task force together, if you like, between using our relocation team and the travel team to look at how we need to address it. The biggest thing you've heard today is you've heard immigration scare stories, you've heard tax scare stories. You need a technology, you need a method to know all this stuff. You can't be an immigration expert or a tax expert, you hire those people in. So what we had to do was source a sort of a technology, if you like, to manage this for us, which we've managed to do. And so within Ford, and I'm talking about this later on a masterclass, if you want to come and join me at 4:10, I think it is. But what we did was selflessly plugging myself.
Yeah, very good.
But we, by using a technology and having everybody funnel through that one technology, because within Ford, everybody needs pre-trip approval. So you can't go anywhere without having sign-off from your manager, depending on where you're going, and it goes up the grades depending on how far you want to go. So you funnel yourself into this pre-trip approval tool, and it's at that point we can start asking you the questions. How long are you going for? What is the type of work you want to do when you get there? And the systems we've got in place will make those determinations for you, because it's immigration and tax and social tax logic that's built into the system. So we can effectively manage the traveling population because they're funneled through one thing. Obviously we use TMC, American Express, represented by Mr. Andrew Crawley here at the front of the stage, to manage our travel. So we're using our travel data to feed into the system to talk about, you were talking about, Dave, you know, if you go once, it's fine, but if you're going, let's say, for the 5th time to that destination, that changes the determination of whether you might need a work permit or not, or tax or whatever it may be. So we feed in historic travel information, expense information, and that allows us to put the right determination onto the traveller for that individual trip. And then there's, within that, you know, you probably want more of an oversight, more of a global view of, well, what's the red, yellow, green of this? Where's the risk? So it's very important that you've got the right level of reporting, so that live you can see okay, something's going red over there, we need to address that, whether that's a tax issue, social security issue, immigration, and talk to the right people around it. So this is something that is probably a little bit unique because it's relocation and travel working together, because most people in travel, me before I was involved in relocation, fell asleep at the word tax and left the room at the word immigration. So you've got to, it's sort of like embracing the fact that you have to understand this stuff now, but we don't have to understand it to a forensic detail. If you've got the right partners, in the same way that if you have the right travel management partner, your travel's a lot easier. Same with this. If you've got the right immigration and tax partners to guide you through the process, then you're in a much better place to make the right decisions on behalf of your employees. But the biggest thing I can say to you about this is no one's going to thank you for doing it, because it's absolutely murder for anyone who's going through the process. Because like I said before, book your ticket, get your visa, I'm off. And now I'm saying, whoa, what about you need to do a posted worker? What? What's changed? And the biggest thing for everyone in your company is, well, what's changed? It didn't used to be like that. I think Brexit is a good example of what's changed, because we may all need as UK citizens, these work permits from 22 to go anywhere in Europe. And again, if you've got the right technology that you're working with, that technology will tell your people that. You don't necessarily have to know it yourself. You just have to work with the right vendor to tell you that. So it's the message to your company is also a very important one, that it's not business as usual anymore. Things have changed. And if we want to be a compliant company, this is what we're saying in my organization, if you want to do things the right way, do business the right way, we have to operate differently. And along with that comes a lot of training and communication to people about the fact that you just can't operate the way you used to do that before.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. That's I hope that hasn't scared you too much, but it's a very different world you're looking at now, quite clearly, when you have to try and bring all these considerations together. Is there any point in one last try of getting Esther involved? Anything changed? No, it's still the same bad line. Esther, can you hear us?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Hooray! Brilliant. Welcome. Sorry, we've been having problems getting hold of you all the time. Esther, there's an audience here of lots of ladies and gentlemen wanting to hear everything you can tell us about how you've put together your mobility compliance strategy in your company. Please do tell us. The floor is yours.
I can't hear you very well, but I guess it is about compliance to the issues that we encounter. So, yeah, what I can tell you is that the department is immigration and international mobility, and we have my department, which is local. And I think also Stephen said that we need to be really close together to make sure that we get people somewhere in one destination, because that's currently really difficult. Make sure that they are compliant. For example, for instance, the US, you need that letter of exemption. Well, somehow we can inform people on visa part with international mobility scheme, but also on an immigration side. But if you also know more restrictions, that more or less touches minor, and that's really difficult place to solve the distance.
Can you hear? Esther, sorry, just 1 second. Audience, can you understand what Esther's saying? Esther, I hate to say this, but I'm sorry. Unfortunately, it's such a bad line. I really apologise for this, all the work you put in. But just like you can't hear us properly, we can't hear you properly. Unfortunately, I'm really sorry. I think we're going to have to leave it with you. Very humble apologies, but we're learning a lot from this, and hopefully we'll get the technology sorted. I gather there's not enough internet signal here. So really sorry about that. Okay, we'll continue the conversation with those of us here on the stage. Basically, the kind of strategies that Stephen, and we presume Esther, except we couldn't hear it, are putting into place. Carsten and David, do you think all companies need to be looking at doing something similar, working with technology and so on to try and funnel it all in so that these considerations can be worked through before every trip is taken? Carsten, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend that. And also allocating the right resources and a budget. Because if you haven't thought about it before and you start thinking about it now, there will be a cost to it, because there will be potentially work visas, A1s, post to worker directives and so forth, or notifications and so forth. Most companies that have overseen kind of this, they don't have a budget for it. And then again, allocating the resource internally about who's doing what, like Stephen was mentioning. We do see, I think, a tendency last maybe 5, 6, 7 years that mobility and travel tend to work more together, but then when you mention the I and the T word, as you said, then maybe they tend to separate a little bit again. But yeah.
Yeah. Now, Ford is quite a big company. I mean, what's your annual travel spend?
It's about $400 million.
Right, okay, $400 million.
Well, before the pandemic.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Fair point. What if your spend's $4 million or even $40 million? I mean, at what point do you have to start doing something similar to what Stephen's doing? Do you have any views on that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to agree with Carsten, I mean, I would say do something. I mean, for a start, you have to do something. So probably start with some sort of risk assessment. Do you actually know how many people are travelling to begin with? And if there's a centralised system, and I know you have one, some companies don't have that. They still allow their people to, book and claim expenses back. So I think you need to look at policy and process first. What is it you want to do with your business? Make it scalable. Make it work for your business. Selfishly, do you need a technology? Of course, that's going to make it infinitely easier, without shadow of a doubt. You can automate the system, the approval system, the budget, and then the actual actions that come out and the project management of the tasks around that. Not everyone's going to be able to afford that, I understand, but it doesn't have to be a massive implementation. There's software as a service. There's a lot of opportunities out there just to have different sort of programs and models for a scalable solution, basically. And just on the cost side of it as well, I know everyone just sees immigration and tax as it's a money suck, basically. Is you're going to pay money for the services, and then you might have to pay for the compliance and the tax and the social security, etc. There are ways of actually reducing and looking at whether it's refunds or looking at being a bit more effective and efficient around your planning and deployment of people as well. If you're sending the same person to the same country every 4, 5, 6 times, but you've got 4 or 5 with that skill set, that person is going all the time, potentially is going to be more of a cost than the sharing the load amongst different individuals. So yeah, definitely scalable, but you definitely need to do something.
Yeah, fair enough. Right, questions from the audience. Anyone want to ask questions either about any details of any of these complexities, or about strategically how you go about managing it all together? Anyone want to ask anything? Yes, this lady here, if we could get a microphone to her, please. And if you could tell us who you are and who you work for.
Hiya, thank you. I'm Martine from Ace Travel ATG UK, travel management company. Probably more of a question directed to Stephen, I think, with regards to the travel to Brexit, the 90 days in the 180 rule, say UK nationals going into Europe, where the 90 days includes the traveller's personal travel as well, I believe.
Yep.
So I was just curious to know, as a company, how you monitor that and
Yep.
get the buy-in from the traveller to make sure you're still compliant.
Yeah, great question. So through the technology we use, there's a tracking of your days, sort of obligation, if you like, that we ask people to use. So you go into this system that you use to create your pre-trip approval, and within there is like a calendar. So it's effectively calendarizing your time in your home country and then your time away. And as you say, that would include those leisure days as well in those 2 places, personal days. Yeah. So it's within the technology that we use. The challenge is, as you probably know, is making people do it. But again, it's all part of this very long journey, and the various elements of that very long journey, and the sort of the re-education of business travellers from a certain behaviour to a new one, and I think that will take some time.
So tell us a bit more about that. How are you re-educating them? How are you communicating to get them to do the behaviours that you want from them?
I don't want to be flippant. It's a lot. It's a huge task of communication. We actually haven't got to the formal launch of all of this yet. We're still building some of it, but it has to be sort of a company-wide, top-down message, because our organisation works very much top-down with the messaging, but it also has to be sort of online training and constantly reinforced. I think that's the challenge. So we have, like I say, a travelling population that is used to operating one way, and the question we constantly hear back is, well, what's changed? Why do we need to do it? And in my organisation, if you're pushing that way, it's a lot harder than if somebody is telling you, thou shalt do this. And that, unfortunately, that's how it works where I work. I mean, if I think about, talking to Alison Rogan at Barclays about this the other day, it's a lot harder for her with the culture of her organisation versus, for example, ours, where people are used to a sort of a top-down message, and that's what everybody tends to do. So it's not a one-off thing either. It's a continual thing. It's a thing that we'll use the travel agencies to support with messaging, as well as the system itself that we go in to use.
So are you working with your internal comms department to develop a strategy around this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It would be interesting to hear what you come up with and what you find does and doesn't work around that. Does anyone else on the panel have any advice about communicating these kind of essential behavioural changes?
Well, you definitely need a communication strategy for it, because it's not necessarily well received amongst the travellers, because maybe you've used to do a little bit things on your own, and suddenly you need to adhere to certain new policies, and it's all change, right? And change is not always perceived very well. But it's recommended definitely to have a system and hopefully an app with that track the days. That would be very helpful for this inter-European travel.
Yeah. Could I just add, just agree with everything being said, just the data is a really big issue, because of course you say you're relying on human nature to, not everybody wants to say this is where I am and complete a calendar. So if you look at apps, sometimes when you go to another country it says check in, mark me in, those sorts of things. That's one sort of data source. You can also sort of look at setting up expense codes, so they can't get their expenses back unless they have performed some other, you must have done this, to get that
That's
approved.
a good idea, Dave. I think I'll use that.
Well, that's, let's talk afterwards. There's various data sources available. I know, just very briefly, IP addresses, GPS signals, that's coming up quite a bit now, just to track and trace. I'd be really careful there. Do check legally whether you can do that, because some countries and GDPR, etc., that's not the best option, and you need employee consent and things like that. But I think look at the data sources, and that change management process absolutely needs communications and HR input.
And when it comes to the tracking, there's some companies are working with travel security, and then they track anyway. So maybe you want to talk to them and figure out what they do and how they solve the compliance GDPR thing.
Sorry, one last thing, because you mentioned personal days, those sort of vacation days. It's really difficult, hugely difficult. So when you're getting close to those sort of thresholds, and I'm talking just from a tax perspective, that somebody you're thinking is approaching a threshold that you may have set internally, or that 183, that magic 183 days, you'll set an alert beforehand. So if someone's at 150, you stop, you review, you contact that person, and you find out they've taken a 3-week holiday with their family. That's what you need to double check. So it's all part of that process building. It takes time, but again, that's part of the communication piece.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions? Who'd like to ask the next question? Anyone? Okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. Thanks. If you could get the microphone to the front row, please.
Part of that process.
Oh my God.
Hi.
Hello.
It's Josephine from American Express Global Business Consulting. I was wondering, how did you change, have you revised, for example, your travel policy to include that process, and how do you deal with compliance in that process? So do you have, for example, have you noticed more in compliance towards your actual travel policy in the rest of the processes because you embedded this technology? how exactly do you manage
So,
inquiries?
good question. Yeah, it's not. We've recently just revised our travel policy, and that step is not in there. Does it have to be in there? I don't know. Maybe not. I think to answer the question, I think because we all follow this pre-trip approval process, and everyone has to go into that place to do any kind of travel, we'll get you. We'll catch you as you're in the process, and so you'll be sort of compliant by default, because irrespective of what your request is, you still might need tax support, you still might need immigration support, and those services will be initiated. So the sort of the very nature of how fortunately we're set up. I mean, if we didn't have a pre-trip approval process pre-pandemic, we were thinking of getting rid of it, because we benchmarked ourselves against a lot of companies, and a lot of companies didn't have one. So we sort of felt we were maybe a little over-controlled. But it turns out that we're quite fortunate, because like I say, we've got that one system everybody has to use, and so we obtain compliance, if you like, through that process.
I suppose the wider point here, for everyone really, but probably particularly you, Stephen, is that what it means is that a few years ago we used to be bandying about phrases in travel management like open booking and traveller centricity, and basically letting it all hang out for the travellers and let them book any way they want, and how we'd accommodate that. But because of the way the world's going, particularly on all these different compliance issues, and most recently COVID on top of all the other stuff we've talked about today, you can't do that anymore. You have to have a policy in which you say you will book through these channels.
Yep.
And part of the reason for saying you will book through these channels is so you can do all this tracking for all these different reasons we've been talking about. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's 100% right, but also it's a safety and security thing as well. So, we've always said to book through the travel agency so we know where you are. So before any of this happened, we need to know where you are in case there's whatever, natural disaster, terrorism, so we know who's there. You go into our security systems that you were talking about, put a circle around the destination, and then get in touch with the people. So it's absolutely necessary.
Okay, thank you. Time for one last question. Yes. It's got to be a quick question and quick response as well, please.
Yes, hi, Mia and Rose, same company. So does this apply for companies that are headquartered in Europe, these tax laws and all that?
Yeah, so very simple, yes. So it's every country has their own domestic rules, and I think that's worth checking first. And then, of course, there are international tax agreements in places I mentioned earlier. So you just really have to look at where your company footprint is, where you're operating from, and then work out what risk there is and what tolerance level you have around that. But I think this is where I think we've all been saying the tax authorities aren't stupid. Don't think they're stupid. They know they'll be coming. If they're looking at different laws, the way of working's changed. They'll be looking at their rules and legislation. So I think, as I said, mentioned that sort of risk assessment first is a good thing. But those rules are there. They always have been there. It's just that perhaps we haven't all taken them very seriously.
I would say as well on that, Dave, that if you have a system in place where you are tracking these things, and you may not be compliant in all cases, but in the case of audits by tax authorities, by the very fact that you're showing that you have some method of tracking and some form of control, that's a massive mitigation into any kind of action local tax authorities may take, because they can see that you have control over what you're doing. If it's those people who say, I don't know, maybe we've got 6 people in Belgium, or maybe we've got 60, I don't know. That's not as good as, here's the system, here's the tool, have a look.
Yeah, that's the message I hear time and again from tax and legal people. If you can't just say, I didn't know anything, or we couldn't be bothered. If you've at least shown you made some sort of effort, even if you haven't got it all precisely right, that will, if you have to start then negotiating with authorities about whether you're going to be in trouble or not, you'll be in a lot more trouble if you've done nothing at all. Great. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm just going to grovel with apologies to Esther one more time. I'm so sorry, Esther. I don't know if you can hear me even, but that we couldn't get you involved as we would have liked. But thanks to everyone for putting up with that. But I think what you'll agree is that the heard from our three speakers has been absolutely first rate. So please join me once again in thanking all three of our speakers.